cancer. I said, those doctors are getting it. Right, where am I going? Straight on. That's Bournemouth, isn't it? Straight on.
Big filming day today, boy. So big filming projects require big locations, so welcome to the Jurassic Coast. So this has taken some time and some patience to get this together. There's been lots of toing and froing, but we finally got it together. We are humbled and feel lucky enough to be able to pick the brains of one of the most influential figures within the psychedelic community. This man needs no introduction, so please welcome Dr. Andrew Gallimore.
You're very welcome indeed. It should be a lot of fun, very interesting discussion, I hope.
Alright, so for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Andrew Gallimore, Dr. Andrew Gallimore, can you please tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are?
Sure, my name's Andrew Gallimore. I'm a computational neurobiologist, pharmacologist, chemist and a writer. I'm currently living here in beautiful Okinawa, in the one of the southernmost islands of Japan, where I study the brain, I research, I use computational modeling to study how the brain works. Most importantly, I think about and I write about every day this incredible molecule that's found throughout the world, including on this little island where I live, called dimethyltryptamine.
So this is the Dreaming Jaguars Q&A with Dr. Andrew Gallimore.
Okay, Dr. Gallimore, what I would really like to know is what is a hallucination and what is actually happening in the brain when we have these visions?
So if you want to understand hallucinations, first of all you have to understand, what is the real world, what's going on when you look around, you see this beautiful world around us, what's actually happening there, and how does that differ from what we would call a hallucination. All the time, when you are experiencing the world that you're experiencing, this subjective world, is always a world that's being constructed. It's being constructed by your brain. And this world is being constructed by information that's being generated by your brain. And that's always true. That's true whether you are awake in kind of normal waking life, whether you are dreaming perhaps, or whether you are at the peak of a psychedelic trip and perhaps having some quite outrageous and rather bizarre hallucinations. Those hallucinations are equally real. They're as real as the normal waking world. The difference is that the kind of the relationship between the mapping, if you like, between what's going on in your brain and what's going on in the outside world changes. The normal waking world, although it's constructed entirely by the brain, it has some kind of mapping, it has some kind of functional relationship to the external world, to whatever it is, to all that information that's being generated by the external world. There's some kind of relationship to it, and it's a functional relationship. It allows you to make predictions, it allows you to kind of to predict what's going to happen next, to make decent decisions to ensure your survival, that kind of thing. So a hallucination is built in exactly the same way as a normal perception, but the mapping between what's going on in the brain and the world constructed by the brain and what's going on in the environment changes, and it might not be as functional, it might not be as adaptive, but it's equally real. So some people describe hallucinations better not as kind of false perceptions or incorrect perceptions, but as non-adaptive perceptions that aren't quite as functional, but they may be more beautiful, they may be slightly stranger, but they're just as real as normal waking perceptions, just altered.
My question is, DMT gives its users a very similar experience all the way through, so why is it that other psychedelics, other psychedelic compounds don't seem to follow this same path?
So that's really the question, is what's special about DMT? Why should DMT have this remarkable ability just to switch the channel so perfectly? Is it just a coincidence that the most commonly occurring, kind of ubiquitous, naturally occurring psychedelic drug just happens to be the one that has this beautiful ability to switch the reality channel, or is there something more to it? I think there's something more to it. I get this feeling, profound, undeniable sense that DMT is more than just a naturally occurring psychedelic molecule that just happens to be, ubiquitous in our world. I personally think that it is implanted. I think it's here for a reason. I think it's this message that's been embedded in our reality, and it's a message that I think we're now beginning to decode.
Okay, Andrew, my first question would be that my visions seem to follow a particular theme for the most part. Why do you suppose that is, with your knowledge of how the brain works? This seems to cross the boundaries amongst people all over the world. Why do these visions follow a particular theme?
For me personally, it's not the specific kind of entities or specific characters that you meet, but the overall ambience of the DMT space. The DMT space for me has this undeniable and really quite profound comical ambience, which has always led me toward this idea that this reality is perhaps nothing more than some huge giant cosmic game, or even cosmic joke perhaps, and very often various types of being, whether it's the elves or one of the other kind of diverse range of this kind of bizarre panoply of species, they often have this kind of jokey, this gesterish, this mischievous kind of trickster kind of character, as if they're saying, hey, do you get it? Do you get the joke yet? Have you worked it out? Have you worked it out? Have you worked it out?
Right, my next question is, while in the DMT realm, I've encountered many different entities, and on occasion these entities have given me some sort of information or some knowledge which has either changed my perspective or really given me help in my life, changed my life in some way. So my question really is this my subconscious now offering me information that is there and I need it and is helping me, or am I really to believe that there are outside entities in different realities that are possibly feeding me this information that I needed at that time?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I mean, first of all, I'm not really sure what is meant by other, in the sense that how do we differentiate an intelligence, our own kind of psyche, with that of something else, and fundamentally, are we actually part of some deeper, unified intelligence or structure, in which case kind of the idea that that you need to kind of differentiate definitively between your own subconscious and that of another, another intelligence, I think is perhaps meaningless. In terms of the subconscious, we can perhaps kind of draw on Jungian ideas. Carl Jung suggested that the psyche can fragment into small pieces, if you like, and although he was never kind of 100% definitive about it, he never ruled out the idea that certain fragments of the psyche could actually become not only autonomous, i.e. completely independent of the main part of your psyche, your main kind of consciousness, but could actually become conscious themselves. And Terence McKenna, on a number of occasions, suggested perhaps that the elves represent a fragment of your psyche that kind of represents the mischievous, the trickster archetype. So I think, at one extreme we could say that these are completely independent intelligences from an alternate reality, which is kind of what I promoted a lot. Or you could suggest that actually they are more, they're actually fragments, deep fragments of our own psyche, which I think is equally as interesting.
Okay, so my second question, Andrew, would be if DMT does gate access to an alternate parallel dimension, can you give a brief description on how this would happen in the brain and why it would manifest in the way that it does subjectively?
Yeah, so as I said, your subjective world is always constructed from information, and that information is always being generated by your brain. And what your subjective world is the way that information feels from your subjective perspective. That's not at all obvious and is kind of weird and difficult to kind of grok. But that's really what's going on. Your brain is generating that information, and for reasons we don't really seem to understand, that information is somehow experienced subjectively, and the world that you're seeing is what that information feels like from your subjective perspective. So when the information changes and generated by your brain changes, when you take a psychedelic drug, the world changes, your subjective world changes because of that. Now, as I said before, your subjective world, although it's always built from information, it's informed, it's modulated by information that's coming into the brain from the environment, and the type of information that the brain can receive from the environment depends on the information it's generating. So it's kind of like if you've got, you remember those old opera singers when they would take a wine glass, right, and they would and they would sing, and they get the frequency right, and the wine glass would smash. And it's kind of like that. You get this resonance effect, and it's similar to that. It's not quite correct, that particular way of looking at it, but it gets you conceptually. It's kind of correct. The brain can only receive information, patterns of information from the environment that kind of match the information it's generating. So the reason, in short, why the brain can't normally receive information from these kind of alternate realities, what I call these orthogonal dimensions of reality, is because the brain is only able to receive information from this reality. The patterns of information that it's generating don't match this kind of higher dimensional information that is part of this high dimensional DMT hyperspace. So what DMT does is it dramatically alters the informational structure of the brain, the type of information that your brain is generating, and that means that the brain suddenly loses its ability to receive information from this reality, and so this is why you smoke DMT, you lie down, close your eyes and hold tight. There's very little reason to keep your eyes open and try and make sense of the world. The brain loses the ability to receive information from this kind of lower dimensional reality. But what happens is the brain gains the ability to receive information from this high dimensional space. And this is the way that I see it. So that's what's going on. These high dimensional orthogonal realities, they're always there, one quantum away, as Terence McKenna used to say. And the only thing stopping us really from accessing these places is our brain being able to receive information. So as soon as your brain can start receiving information from these orthogonal dimensions of reality, which is affected by the ingestion of DMT, you are immediately transported. You become part of this hyperdimensional DMT reality.
So Andrew, I've been watching lots of YouTube channels about sacred geometry and the dimensions, or the many dimensions that they talk about. So I suppose what I'd like to know from your perspective is this compound, the DMT compound, is that an actual way of us perceiving these other geometrical dimensions, or just dimensions? And that when we take that compound, is it a way of just allowing our brains to perceive something that is always around us?
I think the thing about this kind of sacred geometry stuff, and a lot of the kind of the popular ideas about dimensions, is that dimensions are often kind of misused. They're kind of an abusive terminology, really. I do think that DMT, when you listen to trip reports from DMT users, they consistently describe entering a space that seems to possess more dimensions, more spatial dimensions than this kind of normal, kind of parochial little simple world that we inhabit, at least compared to that space. And that would make sense if this world really was some kind of lower dimensional slice of this higher dimensional structure. If you were gaining access to that, then it's perhaps not that surprising that you would experience a world with a high dimensional structure. And that's also one of the reasons why it's quite difficult to explain DMT without invoking access to some kind of high dimensional structure, because the human brain is evolved in a three-dimensional world, three-dimensional plus time anyway, and so it really it's almost impossible for the brain to kind of render these high dimensional structures. So I'm really interested actually in ways we can actually formally identify whether someone has really been to a high dimensional space. Are there tests that we can do after they come out of the space, or perhaps slightly more difficult once they're in the space? But are there tests we can do that would distinguish between somebody who kind of just had the impression that they were within a high dimensional space, or whether they'd actually had experienced it? Would they perform better on certain types of tests? And people have thought about that, but it's kind of at the moment these studies haven't really taken off.
So Andrew, my next question would be, what is the most frightening entity that you have heard someone else come into contact with? Can you give a description of it? Give me the most, insanely frightening thing that you've heard of, just out of interest.
That's tricky. I mean, people describe, most of the time, fortunately, people tend to describe rather beautiful and kind of experiences where these entities kind of guide them or teach them in some way. But there are, unfortunately, a number of entities that are kind of either visually objectionable or have some kind of malevolent intent. Fortunately, they're not that common. I mean, for me personally, basically, you've got to respect these entities. You have to approach these entities and treat them with due respect. Don't be a cowboy, because if you be a cowboy and you think, okay, I got this, I'm the DMT warrior of some kind, and people do develop this kind of arrogance after using DMT a lot, and those are the kind of people that are most likely to get slapped. But for me, going there with respect and just be aware of the fact that you are going to meet beings that are going to be sometimes quite terrifying. I remember perhaps my most frightening experience was my own fault in a way, in that I don't regret it, but I went into the DMT space and I had a bit of a cavalier attitude. Perhaps, you know, the couple of experiences before that hadn't been that dramatic, and I went in there, thought, right, I'm going to do it this time. I really want to see something incredible. And I met an entity in this domed, like a dark cave with a staff, and he was hooded, hooded, and he was kind of doing this thing with his staff, and I kind of floated over to him like this, and he turned and he looked at me, and I can't remember his face or anything like that, but all I remember saying to him, and this is the mistake you shouldn't make, I said, "Show me what you've got, yeah? Let's see it, I want to see it all," which was the stupidest thing I could have ever have done. And I remember he kind of glided over to me as if to say, "Oh really?" And then he kind of leant and he was kind of looking over me, and then he opened his mouth, and at that point I don't remember the details. I remember there's a really good photo of Terence McKenna on the internet. You can Google it, and it's kind of him sat like this, kind of recreating one of his DMT experiences, and I was fuck. I just remember being totally astonished. I don't remember any details of it, but I just remember like God himself had opened his mouth and shown me the fucking work, shown me the fundamental structure of reality, and it scared the fucking shit out of me. And then he kind of said to me afterwards, yeah, have you had enough? Was that enough for you? So that experience, when people ask me about my experience, I always talk about that one, because that one taught me that you really have to go in there. You really got to respect these beings, because if you don't, you're going to get a slap.
You got me falling. You got me falling.
So Andrew, my next question would be, if we are gating access to these parallel dimensions, do you think we're all accessing the same dimensions, or are we skipping around all over the place, sort of into, you know, if this is if we are now in a small slice of a larger information structure, are we skipping around to all different levels of that information structure, or are we all going to the same place?
Yeah, I do. I think what's quite noticeable about different experiences is that, yes, I mean, the DMT state can certainly be extremely variable, and it does seem to have a number of layers or levels, if you like, and perhaps depending upon dosage, people tend to move into or even through various layers to kind of reach kind of deeper realms, and I don't think there's been any real kind of formal study of that, of, you know, what kind of structures, what kind of intelligences would you meet at some of the lower realms perhaps, compared to some of the deeper realms, which are perhaps only accessible with higher doses. And this is really one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this kind of extended state work, where you can bring people into the DMT space and actually move them, you know, hold the DMT level in their brain constant, but also move them through different levels, different stages, and kind of hold them there. And that would allow you to not only kind of map the DMT space perhaps in the usual kind of sense, the way that we map the Earth as this two-dimensional plane, but actually kind of perform some kind of orthogonal mapping where we can kind of ascertain what kind of, as I say, you know, what kind of beings and structures and forms and you find at these different levels, and how they relate to each other. So yeah, I do think that people can move through different levels of the DMT state.
Okay, so before we perfected the delivery device, there were many times when we probably took far more than we actually meant to, and in those times there was a complete dissolution of the human self, an understanding of the language, And you know, sometimes it took us to a very black, or took me personally to some very black places where there wasn't a lot going on. My question, I suppose, is the amount taken relative to the depth that you might travel into, i.e. further dimensions, or just the depth that you can actually divulge into or disperse into? And why is it when we want to remember so much about these episodes, when we come out we find it very difficult to actually remember?
Yeah, and so blackouts tend to happen when, or what's often referred to as a blackout, when someone takes too much DMT and they kind of, they either black out, as in lose consciousness in some way, or they go through an experience they simply can't recall. So that's kind of the question here. Is a blackout a true blackout in which you kind of lose consciousness, in which you don't have an experience, or is it simply that you can't remember? Now, to the individual, they might actually be the same. You come back, you can't remember what happened. Did you lose consciousness, or you just can't remember it? I mean, I don't spend too much time thinking about them. The problem is, and the problem really with the perennial problem with trying to bring stuff back from the DMT space, trying to remember what the fuck happened, is that memory is a process of reconstruction. Your brain is reconstructing the experience, and for you to be able to remember something, your brain has to be able to reconstruct it. And of course, as you go into the DMT space, your brain is generating and you're experiencing this extremely bizarre, hyper-complex, hyper-dimensional reality that the brain is really only able to construct when there's DMT present. So as soon as DMT leaves the brain and is kind of broken down and cleared away, the brain kind of loses its ability to render the experience in its original high dimensional form, and so it has to kind of make a kind of a loose attempt at trying to render the DMT state in a lower dimensional form, and that's quite tricky. So it could be that as you go to the higher doses and you reach what we call blackout stage, it's simply that the brain really has no idea how to render that experience in your normal waking state. Or it could be just that you actually, there's kind of a sweet spot with DMT. Once you get above a certain level, as is predicted by some theoretical models actually, once you get above a certain level, you simply lose consciousness. So yeah, I'm not overly interested in blackouts.
So touching on now how entities communicate in the DMT space. So for me, seems to be a very large emphasis on visual imagery as opposed to language. So I very rarely hear words, but these entities communicate via imagery and sort of a telepathic, emotional response that you kind of just intuitively understand. What have you heard of experiences of differing ways that these entities communicate?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting question, and it's not really well studied. So for me personally, I don't experience the production of words exactly, and I don't think when people talk about communicating with these entities or talk about saying things to these entities, I don't think they always mean actually physically verbalizing. There tends to be it feels almost kind of like telepathic communication in which you kind of you think you kind of think what you want to say to them, and you receive information from them in the same way. And then there's the whole kind of visible language stuff that McKenna used to talk about, where their way of communicating is completely alien, and that's really, really fascinating. And again, you know, if we could spend more time in that space, you know, that's when we can start to sort of tease apart and try to make sense of all the different ways that they do communicate. And it's going to require linguists, it's going to require mathematicians, it's going to require anthropologists, it's going to require a whole range of different people who know how to, who understand communication much better than I do. So for me, I just kind of do my best to kind of make sense of what's going on and make sense of what they're saying to me. But it's certainly true that this, how we communicate with these beings is going to be improved with kind of a great deal of kind of formal effort in that regard.
So with regards to the extended DMT state research, if we were able to open a testable dialogue with these entities, Andrew, what would be your first question to them, and I suppose why?
Yeah, I mean, whenever people ask me about the kind of the extended state stuff, they always ask, actually, you know, what was the first thing you would say when you were confronted with an alien? And I think we've all thought about this idea of, you know, if we came face to face with an alien, what would we say? But I mean, this extended state stuff, it's not just like kind of a brief sojourn, a brief kind of visitation or an interview with an alien, but we're talking about the beginning of a long-term, quite deep relationship with these beings. So I've never kind of thought of something in a way kind of trivial, really. You know, what's the first thing we would ask? The first thing we're going to do is not, you know, ask the obvious questions. You know, are you real, or kind of, you know, where are you from? These kind of things. But actually, simply trying to understand more deeply how these beings communicate, and opening up a dialogue, establishing communication, establishing two-way communication, and then opening up a dialogue with them, and basically asking them not, you know, who are you or are you real, but you know, what have you got to tell us? You know, what the fuck is going on in this, you know, slice of reality that we appear to be trapped in? Because I certainly think that they know a lot more than we do, and that makes perfect sense. We've got a plane flying overhead there. That certainly makes a lot more sense, that they know a lot more than we do, and I would go in there with a great sense of humility and say, okay, we've made it, we're here, we've arrived, what can you tell us?
Okay, so the extended DMT research is just utterly fascinating. How quickly do you think that will be implemented? And if there were to be any, you know, monumental findings, do you think that would be released to the public in due course?
Yeah, so this extended state stuff is, when I published the model with Rick Strassman back in 2016 now, but to actually this was really like a proof of principle. We were basically saying, you know, does DMT have the kind of required pharmacological, pharmacokinetic properties such that you can actually do this kind of extended state stuff? So you can actually introduce DMT into the brain and actually keep the kind of the concentration level. So that was really what that modelling was about. It's basically a proof of principle. But to actually implement in humans requires a number of other stages. I mean, there's technical stages, so you have to refine the model. The model was kind of an average model for an average human. But really what you need is to have a model that's going to work in anybody and that can be adapted to different body sizes, different physiologies, different metabolic profiles, all these kind of pharmacological, physiological things you need to take into account. So that's going to take time. There is a team actually doing that at the moment. But yeah, and then you've got all these kind of legal and regulatory loops and hoops that you have to kind of jump through to get this kind of work off the ground. So I think it's going to be a while, you know, watch this space.
Andrew, do you think that the DMT state shares any relationship with the death of the human body? And if so, what?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been dead for almost 40 years now, so I don't tend to focus too much on death. You can probably The relationship between DMT and death is kind of interesting. You can probably trace it to Jace Calloway and Rick Strassman, who have suggested that DMT might be produced endogenously. Rick Strassman specifically suggested that DMT was produced at the moment of death and was responsible for the exit of the soul from the body. But for me, what's more interesting is the idea, is the actual experiences of people. They go into the DMT space and they experience this profound sense of deja vu, like they know that they've been there before, and it kind of dawns on them, kind of washes over them this realization that not only have they been there before, but that they were there before they were born, and you can perhaps flip that and suggest, well, if they've been there before they were born, perhaps they're gonna be there after they die. But for me personally, I don't focus on that too much. I'm more interested in what's going on right here in this world before the lights go out.
Okay, Andrew, so this is the final question, and it's again referring to the extended state DMT research. And speaking completely hypothetically, how would we even bridge the gap between ourselves and a hyper-intelligence? What would that look like? And can you give an example of the early stages of that relationship?
We're in the very, very early stages of this kind of relationship. I'm proposing here something that is truly monumental. I'm proposing that we're gonna, within the next few years, the next maybe couple of decades, we're gonna have established definitively the existence of intelligences, not just beyond Earth, but beyond this universe, beyond this reality. Intelligences that we can, at will, communicate with stably, two-way communication with intelligence from another reality. That's astonishing stuff. So yeah, we're certainly at the early stages, but we're at the early stages of a process that kind of leapfrogs over intergalactic citizenship all the way to interdimensional citizenship. We're going to be citizens not just of the cosmos, but of this higher dimensional reality. We'll be citizens of hyperspace, essentially. So I see this intelligence, or these intelligences we meet, as kind of beings that are perhaps further along the evolutionary trajectory than we are. Henri Bergson said that the universe is a machine for making gods, and we're on the way to kind of godhood. I think we're about halfway there, but no doubt within the next 20, 30, 40 years, who knows, it could be within the next 5 years, we're going to be casting off these kind of our material body finally, and permanently, and exiting and becoming these kind of interdimensional citizens of hyperspace. And when beings from other lower dimensional slices of reality kind of burst into our hyperdimensional realm, we will be amongst this kind of thronging elfin crowd, cheering and welcoming them home.
Dr. Andrew Gallimore, we cannot thank you enough for offering to do this show with us. It really means the world to us to know that there's people like you out there that are going to help change the perspective of psychedelics and help change the world's view on what these compounds can do for humanity. We're big fans of yours, and we really appreciate the fact that you're coming on the show today.
Finally, Andrew, where can people go to find you? Where can they see your work? We want to get your stuff out there as much as humanly possible. The book's fantastic. Please just tell people where they can see you and where they can find out more about you.
So the first port of call is my website, buildingalienworlds.com. You can also follow me on Instagram, please, Alien Insect, all one word, or on Twitter, same handle, Alien Insect. Of course, you can buy my book, Alien Information Theory, which describes my vision of reality, my vision of the relationship between DMT and our reality, and basically everything I know about DMT, everything I've learned so far. And that's about it. Over and out.
That's another one from us. We'll see you soon.
That's the end of Dreaming Jaguars.